Hello! First episode for me with a microphone.
Welcome, Annie, to the world of podcasting with an actual microphone rather than your AirPods. And welcome to the Career Coven to all of our listeners. This episode today is on hybrid working. I think you and I are aligned on some things on this and not on others. Personally, I'm a really big fan of working from home.
Yeah.
Probably more than you are. But shall we start by thinking around what we mean?
Okay, so what I mean by hybrid working is working sometime in the office and sometime at home. What do you mean by hybrid working?
So I saw something on LinkedIn today, which was quite timely for this, which was where someone was saying, and it, had like thousands of likes, and they were talking about how companies define hybrid working and flexible working is probably different to how some individuals define it. And I think she was sort of going on a I live outside of London and you're missing out on my talent sort of rant, which
Yeah.
I get, but I think I think you're right that it's you can work at home or you can work in the office, but I think that the distinction is like, do you have to? Um,
Yes.
and
Yeah, okay.
are you set up for both?
Yeah, like properly set up as a company for both. And as an individual, I guess.
Yeah, because I think some companies um, are actually probably just remote working companies that go in sometimes.
Yeah,
Um,
and vice versa. I think you can have like really talented people that get hired remotely into a team culture where everyone works in the office, and then they just forget to make things like properly remote enabled and like properly set up their like working rooms and office space so that like cameras work and stuff. And I think that can be really, really hard for the person who's just really good and so got hired remotely into like an in-person culture.
that's quite interesting because I don't really have experience of special carve outs for people on hiring for remote on a remote basis. Is that what you're seeing?
I think sometimes it can. I think sometimes it can make sense, especially if you have like some sales in the US. You might have like one US team member or
Yeah.
one
Okay.
European team member. I think it can also. I think it can also work if you've got someone like really specialist that you really want to work with that just like doesn't want to travel. Like I think designers, there are a lot of fully remote designers that do great work but just don't come into the office. I've certainly like seen that and I've seen it work really well, to be honest. But yeah, I think there are a few kind of exceptions.
And okay, next question. What do you make of kind of mandates to be in? Obviously, we've been in the pandemic when we were full time remote working, and I since then haven't been in a place that's had a mandate to work in the office. So, what's your view?
I I have mixed feelings about this. I do think there are real positives to having people work and collaborate in person. And I do think that people at the start of their career really miss out a lot if they are not in the office. And I also think there is a level of trust involved in hybrid working. Um, that's just Susan dropping her ball at my feet. Um, so I think where I land is I do think in some cases it's reasonable to mandate people in. And I personally think things like saying we want you here in your probation period for 2 or 3 days a week so that you can properly onboard into the team, get to know people, but also you can like build that trust of like, okay, this person's really like getting stuck in and not just not doing that at home could be reasonable. I also think for more junior people, for graduate level people, I think it could be a reasonable thing to ask. And I don't mind it. I think in tech and in startups, you're seeing a lot more of like it's 3 days a week in person.
Really?
Um, yeah, 100%. I think that's changing quite fast.
That's a real pendulum swing, though, because like in the pandemic, they were like, we can all go fully remote forever. So it's really fascinating that that pendulum has swung back in the space of the last, whatever, 4 years.
Yeah, I believe most of the big tech companies are now saying 3 or 4 days back in the office. I will confirm that and put it in the show notes, but I do think that that's the theme that um, is kind of coming back now. What I don't think is reasonable is like I don't think it would be very reasonable to ask you to suddenly be 5 days a week in the office with no justifiable reason when
Mm.
your like output is fine, good, and you have proven that you are like working in a great way in this kind of more flexible setup. I think that's a really hard ask for the employer because I can't see the reasoning if people have been working productively in a way and performing well to ask them to kind of come back in. It's just very hard for me to understand like what that logic would be in many companies. But yeah, I think there are some exceptions where it can make a bit more sense. And I personally, I like the kind of 3 day in, 2 days at home. But I would be comfortable working in probably both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of the work that I do is calls for people in other markets anyway. So even if I was in the office, there's no point in me being in the office because they're not in the office. But I think I wanted to pick up on one of the points that you made, which was about the kind of start of the career experience in the office. I have definitely noticed, like in the pandemic, people who did not work in the office before the pandemic ever have some like really quite strange behaviors that I think just probably wouldn't have existed if they had been in an office environment and sort of learned by osmosis and observation of what is kind of normal or
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
you know,
Acceptable.
maybe don't wear trackies into the office or a football shirt and
Oh my
things
gosh,
like
yeah.
that. And then I think it's also that there is a really different mindset in my experience of managing people in their early 20s where the threshold of like what keeps them at home and like also what they disclose to their manager is very low. If you ask them to come in, like, we'll be like, oh, we've got a team day on Wednesday, and they'll be like, oh, but I've got an Amazon package being delivered. And you're like, what?
Yeah, what is that about? Yeah, I agree. I think there are really, really big differences that are most marked in people who got their first job in the pandemic for sure. And that's why I think it is really actually very valid to ask those people to kind of come back in and integrate IRL, because the norms and stuff they might shift a bit, and I think they really have shifted towards a more flexible outlook on work. But things like wearing trackies to work, I mean, it's just not that's not going to be something that like flies. I don't think in the majority of working environments. And I also think with the like epidemic of loneliness in that generation and in the generation that were at university during the pandemic and had to do it remote, it's a great way to get to know people and have more social connection. And I think that's really, really important. And I certainly look back on my first few jobs as places where I made like some of my incredibly good friends. And I would have hated doing that early 20s and mid 20s chapter without the in person connection.
It's so true. Like all of my adult made friends are all friends that I've picked up from different places I've worked. And like that's actually just a huge part of my 20s. But I think your loneliness point is really interesting. And I also wonder whether it's partly fueled by social anxiety from these youngsters. Um, because I do a bit of work with a local school, and they have kind of a pattern in persistently absent students. And the common theme amongst all of them is they just have anxiety about being around other people. And I think that's
Yeah.
really messed. I actually really feel for people who hadn't fully formed their like social
Yeah.
capabilities when they were told not to hang out with anyone, because that's sad.
100%. And yeah, I mean, I definitely have that within my family. People that really struggle with social anxiety, and it was triggered by the pandemic, more school age, as you say. But yeah, I just, without your university freshers week, like that all being online. I mean,
Oh, the
oh
breakout
God.
rooms. Oh,
Breakout rooms. But yeah, I do think it's important that there are like opportunities for those people to come and connect in real life, develop those social skills, meet a wider variety of people than you tend to meet in universities, like, and possibly schools. So yeah, I just think there's something really important about that first couple of jobs, getting some IRL experience. But I think what I do believe to be really important about flexible working is like what it has done for parents and caregivers of all kinds. And I think that the benefits there can't really be ignored.
yeah,
And yeah, obviously we're not parents yet, but certainly something from a kind of hirer as the employer perspective is like, I also respect like core hours as a setup so that people
mm,
can like work their own, work around their own lives, and especially around like caregiving responsibilities. And yeah, I do think that a really hard line on like 5 days a week, long hours in the office, you are now going to exclude most parents. Like, I
yeah.
think that's true.
I think that's really fair, and I think a core hours is really good actually, because it also just accounts for people who just have totally different preferences about working in the morning. Like I actually have quite a few friends who are like crack of dawn wake up and like knock out their best work before 8 a.m., which is the like polar opposite of me. And I'm always like, how have you done so much work? And like I've literally just had a coffee. But I'm
Yeah,
much more productive in the evening. So I think that's also just a helpful thing to do. But you're right about flexible working being more of a feminist issue,
yeah,
particularly for women who are more likely to have those caring responsibilities. And I suppose, I mean, I'm really lucky that I work in a really flexible environment. I'm sure you do as well in your role, but I'm also sure that there are many women who have changed their employment based on the ability to get these sorts of accommodations that are like, who arranged for school to finish in the middle of the day? Like,
God,
who does
obscene.
that?
Yeah, it's crazy. And it's so hard. And of course, like, yeah, when there are hard deadlines in your day, like the kids get left at the school gate, you know you're going to be there. Like, that's the
Yeah.
truth, right? If your job doesn't flex around it, then the thing that's going to have to change is probably the job. And I do think that that is a quite big attitudinal shift from the employees that came with the pandemic. Is like,
Mm,
actually not gonna I'm not going to just put everything in my life on hold for work. And even really, really hardworking people I know have softened because of like the complete lack of work life balance many people had, including us, during those
mm.
like 2 years. I think it just gave a lot of people more perspective about like balance and a few boundaries. um so yeah, I think it's really interesting. What do you think, as someone that is quite pro flexible working from home, what do you think are the benefits of in person, if anything?
So when I was running a bigger team, that was definitely for me the most important reason to come into the office was to. I think part of it when you're a team leader is being responsible for the culture that you set in the team. And
Yeah,
for me,
yeah,
it's really important that when you're working with your colleagues and you're spending 40 plus hours a week with them, that you actually have a positive experience with that. So when I was running a bigger team, we would do, you can pick 2 days out of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to come in. So really likely to have a crossover with most people, or like we would once a month get a team lunch or something. And I just think that's really important for kind of social cohesion, which helps for collaboration, and it just helps people's enjoyment and fulfillment. But I think also just it's a lot easier to kind of undertake your pastoral responsibilities in person. I found
Yeah.
it is so difficult to understand how someone's well-being is when you're not physically with them, and I think you get so much from just like their body language, or like whether they're sighing, or whether they're like rubbing their forehead aggressively, or crying.
Yeah.
You could hide all of those things if you're at home, and
Yeah.
you just wouldn't know. And I think you can just see a lot more together. So I think that's really important. And then I would add, it's probably better to have really difficult conversations in person than on Zoom.
Agreed.
Like,
100%. I was actually, that's what I was going to ask you is, do you think there are some conversations that should only really be had in person?
I think if you're having a difficult performance conversation or a difficult feedback session, you would really ideally do that face to face. Like, I remember I tried to do one, and this was a person who did not love coming into the office. And I'd sort of been like very encouraging of them coming, and had booked a room, and then they just didn't turn up to the office. And I was like, well, I'm sorry, I did want to do this in person, but unfortunately, it's not worked out that way. So we had to do it over Zoom. But I would never choose to do that, because I think you lose a lot of kind of empathy and like sensing of what's going on when it's on a
Agreed.
screen.
Yeah, and I think there's those physical cues, like you said, and body language, which is it's so much easier to read like tone when you can see someone's full body, both
Mm.
ways, right? Both negative tone and positive tone. Um, I think it can be incredibly difficult to read how some people are doing when you only see their like floating head on a screen for months. And yeah, I am sure that I have been guilty um of missing a lot of important things as a like line manager and like a team leader, because so much of our work is remote. I definitely would say, if you're going to fire someone, in most cases, unless there's a really good reason not to. And that really good reason might be that that person is really uncomfortable, like
Mm.
coming in that like, state that they might be in. But otherwise, I think it's like respectful to have those kinds of conversations in person. Especially often as people leave like they leave the company immediately after that, so don't
Yeah.
have that much connection. And if you think they need more support, it's easier to be able to tell that they are in a position where they might need more support. um so that's definitely one. And I think it's like much nicer also if you're doing the good news stuff of like promoting people, and as you say, kind of team celebrations. Like, you
Mm.
can do team celebrations like online. I mean, I remember Alva's
Oh,
Christmas party was online, and it was so
this is
fucking bleak.
such a pandemic flashback of like us all doing like weird online activities, like an online escape room or something horrific.
Yeah. I remember ours was like really, it was really sweet. And we did gingerbread making virtually, which was really cute. And then at the end, I just told them, thank you so much, and like have a great Christmas stuff. And I was just crying. I was crying so much. And I think they all probably just shut their laptop and were like, oh my God, what the fuck is this woman? But yeah, I mean, I don't think that was anywhere near as fun as like, doing gingerbread houses would have been if we'd been together in person.
You
So
could eat them.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I think there is like the really positive stuff, it's nice to do in person. The really negative stuff, I think, is like respectful to do it in person, unless there's a reason not to. And yeah, I probably have a preference for like any feedback session that's like quite well thought through and mutual. Ideally, I would prefer that in person, because again, you can sense tone,
Yeah.
and it can be so much more relaxed, I think, mutually, when you can see that someone is not like coming at you. But when it's just a talking head, it can be hard. I'm someone that like gesticulates a lot, I move around a lot, and I think that could in some ways be negative if you're just a talking head on a screen. Don't know why I keep saying talking head, but I do. So there we go.
Okay, so I want to talk about trust in a hybrid working environment, because I think this is usually the great divider of
Yeah.
who has to or doesn't have to go into the office. And I guess the sort of more old school view of it is, if I can see you, I know that you're working. What do we think about that?
So I believe and want to be someone that judges people purely on output. Like that is definitely where I want to be. And on a good day, I am that person. I do think that on a bad day, I can not be that person. I can admit that. Like, especially if I feel that there are like urgent problems to solve and I do not feel an urgency from my team to solve them.
Mm,
And I'm there sort of like waiting for us to kind of get going on this. And there's a bit of a kind of laissez faire, let's all kind of dial in at 11 kind of approach. That for me is like, right, tomorrow I'd like to see you at 8 a.m. in the office. Like, and I think it's probably a development area, but I do think that I mostly try and be a very outcome based person, but there are definitely days where I slip into a more old school
mm,
um, kind of way of being. Um, and yeah, I think that I've definitely been known to say like, well, the working day it starts at 9, you
yeah.
know, and I think that people that I've worked with that I can be honest with, I have definitely expressed frustration when I don't feel like people are really online until kind of 10. That for me
Mm,
is a bit like, do you know what? Like, unless we've agreed that your core hours are different, which is a totally different thing and fine. If it's just like, oh, I'm at home, so I'm not gonna be on until kind of 10ish.
10 is egregiously late, though. Like,
Honestly, like the reason I think in there's so far, well, in the cultures I've been in recently, so I've had the corporate experience where you couldn't not be online at 10 because the meetings start at 9.
start at 9. That's
And
my life.
exactly. And they barrage you until 5, and then you can do your work after that. Whereas in startups, there is a lot more flexibility often. There are far fewer meetings, in my experience, because you're usually doing, higher levels of output. I can only say that from my experience, but like, that's what I would say. So therefore, there aren't these hard lines in the day of like, we check in at 9. There probably are in some places, but there aren't in some of the places I've been. And yeah, I think on my worst weeks, I can definitely be a bit like, minimum, I am expecting minimum a 9 to 5. Absolute bare minimum. But yeah, I try to still be outcome based, she says as she shouts a bare minimum 9 to 5 at the
I think it's also,
my,
I think it depends on who you're working with and what they're like and what they're motivated by. Like if I'm working with a really high performer, I am not keeping a single moment of my
yeah,
eyes
yeah,
on
yeah,
their
yeah.
time. I'm like,
That's so true.
you can
That
just
is so
manage
true.
it however you want. I really don't care. I think the difference is when you get into sort of the medium to low performers,
Yeah,
and that's when the doubt starts to creep in
yeah,
about like, are you actually working the whole time?
yeah,
Um, and I think it's quite difficult to convince yourself out of that mindset when you've got that creeping doubt starting to set in. Um,
yeah.
and
You're 100% right.
and I think
Now
it's
that you said
also, if you if there are a couple of hours during the working day when they're like not responsive to you, I'm immediately like, well, you're not working, are you? Well, like feasibly, they probably could be working. They could have just like closed their IMs to focus, which is what I also do. So like that's very hypocritical of me. But
it.
it is difficult to know when there isn't a solid drum of output and a constant responsiveness. You're like, not convinced.
Yeah, and you're right. It is. it is something to like manage and reflect on, right? Because some jobs require so much more like deep work. Like engineering is such an obvious one. You know, they may not be online all day, but they may have done so much in the code base. I mean, obviously other engineers can usually see that, but like, you know, as a manager of engineers, for example, I wouldn't necessarily be all red flagged if they haven't, you know, replied on Slack. But you are totally right that all the times I can now think of where I'm like, you work a 9 to 5, and that is contractual, um, is when someone is definitely a mid to low kind of performer, or just very early. You know, I would
Mm.
say like if I don't yet feel someone is like fully knows what they're doing and I would expect them to be asking a lot of questions, I can sometimes be like, oh, okay, given that thing, I haven't heard anything. That's a bit weird. But as you say, it's like it's the combination of kind of lack of responsiveness, but also low output that then, you know, you start to get your sort of back up a bit. But
So
yeah,
then what is the answer? Is the answer you're allowed more freedom when you're higher performing? Is
I
that
just well, I think that will always be true. Right. I think that's just a natural phenomenon. I think it is about like building trust and actually being um quite what's the word I'm looking for? Deliberate about setting your ways of working. So for example, if you are someone that likes to from 9 till 10 every day clear your email inbox and therefore not be on Slack or not be on Teams Messenger, that's fine, right? Just tell manager Beck that that's what you do and you just like to have a clean out and you like to just sort, and it's like that's how you get organized and that's how you start your day. Ideally it wouldn't take an hour every day, but like, you know, there might be like that's the first kind of 30 minutes and so they don't want meetings, and that's really reasonable. Or if you do have I think a core hours need, that's also totally fine. Just say it to your
yeah.
team, say it to the people you work most with. And I've seen a lot of people start to put in their email signatures like my core hours are this, but so therefore I work flexibly in the evenings. I don't expect a response from you, but I will be sending emails at all hours kind of thing.
Yeah.
um which I also think is fine. It's very clear, like, okay, you don't
Can
work
I
all.
can I say something a bit snarky now?
Yeah, be as snarky as you want.
I my least favorite email to receive is the ones where you know that they just want you to know the timestamp that they sent it. This has no correlation to like childcare or anything. It's just like sending a really unimportant email at like 9 p.m. being like, let's discuss tomorrow. And you're like, you could have just spoken to me tomorrow. Like,
Yeah, okay.
it's poor
Yeah,
behavior. This is like weird online presenteeism. I'm like, I don't
yeah, that's true.
bore off. Like, I'm not interested.
And they're probably just watching TV,
Yeah.
you know.
Just go
Like,
and enjoy your TV. I'd respect that a lot more.
I think the thing that I'm really guilty of is like, so I do, as you know, I'm like so sporadic on communication, professionally, personally. You know, it can come at any time in any form. And but lots of people have given me feedback that like you shouldn't be emailing me at the weekend. I don't want to get stuff on Sunday. Blah, blah, blah. So I think a like horrible habit of mine that I have got into is just timed emails. So using Gmail, like 8 a.m. Monday, everyone in the team gets like 18 different emails with all of my like separate thoughts that I have had over the weekend that I haven't been like allowed to share. Um, and that was definitely something I sort of picked up in corporate land, because I was a bit like, okay, it actually seems that I can only work really on weekends. I can only do my like thinking on weekends and evenings. But, you know, this is a much more 9 to 5 culture. There are a lot more parents. I do want to respect, like, you know, that. So yeah, I just got into this terrible habit of it would be like 8 a.m. Monday, you get everything. It's like, oh, actually, Annie, I 8 a.m. I got 17 emails from you today. It's like,
It's like when you get off a plane and you've done loads of work and you like
exactly.
hit the Wi-Fi and you're like, enjoy that.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
let's take some listener questions. How do I get my team to come back to the office? They all want to work from home all the time.
Well, it's carrot or stick. It's up to you, really.
What do you do with your team?
I mean, if they haven't done anything wrong, it's definitely like carrot, It's like, wouldn't it be fun to do this in person? Let's have a brainstorm on this. Let's go for a drink after work to celebrate X. Obviously that's the preferred way is to kind of tantalize them back into your
With
office.
post-it notes. That's how I normally do it. I'm like, we'll get the post-it notes out. It's going to be fantastic.
Nothing beats in-person collaboration. Laptops closed. Let's all get together. Exactly. A workshop. Also,
Mm.
one of the little phrases you can dangle in front as a little carrot. Everyone likes a workshop day. Negative is like, we're just not making any progress on this. Everyone's got to come in tomorrow so that we can. I have to admit, I can't think of a time where I have like done that.
Mm.
Where it has been like team performance is so poor that I've like pulled them kind of back into the office. But I can definitely one-on-one think of lots of times where it's been like, I've really liked to go through this in person. I think we're missing a few things. Yeah, like more of a kind of feedback and like, let's actually solve this problem together. Um, but yeah, I would say much more on balance. It's about kind of making it tempting and fun and productive to be in the office. I think the thing that I really understand about the frustration of being asked to come in, and often, for some people travel significant distances if you moved outside of London, is when you come in, no one is there.
Mm.
And then the person that you thought was going to be there is like, oh, sorry, wires crossed. This meeting's now remote. I've heard some absolutely insane things with interviews recently where people have like flown countries to be at an in-person interview, and then like people have made the meeting remote when the person's
No,
in their off. Like that is the most completely insane thing I have ever
that's
heard.
bad.
But yeah, I think mostly when I hear people complaining, and I would be interested to get your perspective on this as well, but mostly when I hear people complaining about like, oh, coming back into the office, it's because they are like, well, no one does anything in the office. There isn't in-person collaboration. There aren't important discussions that like need us to be in person. So you're just actually watching me, which then and maybe you are, right, because of what we've just said, but like it's a bit like, well, they just sort of want to watch me to make sure I'm working, and I resent that a bit. So I
If
think you just,
anyone watched me in the office, they would think I was the least productive person on the planet, because the office is like my work socializing day. And that's when I get the least amount of work done, but it's when I get my most like relationship building done. And I don't think relationship building necessarily has to feel like there's a productive output to it specifically. Like I think
yeah,
it's enables you to be able to be better at your job. But
yeah,
honestly, if someone watched me in the office, they'd be like, she gasses all day.
that's
And
influencing, babe. Isn't that influencing? That's how we influence.
um, maybe, maybe not all of the chat that I have, but I remember in the office explaining to like a bunch of people, you won't know this, but a very dramatic thing that happened on a TV show called Scandival.
So yeah,
And
I agree there.
and it took like half an hour, and there was like diagrams, and everyone was like looking at me like, you're insane. But it's can't all be work. It's got to be a bit of play. Um,
Agreed. And I think that philosophy is actually a good way to get people back to the office, is like, it can't all be work.
yeah,
Like,
for me, going into the office is like a joy day rather than like a slog day. I'll do my slog days at home, like deep work. You know,
yeah, agreed.
you
Agreed.
get
That's
your like comfiest clothes on and like you buckle down and you do it. I don't want to sit in the office and buckle down and ignore everyone. I want to sit in the office and be like, what's happening over here? Like, oh, I've heard about this. Tell me more. Blah blah blah. And like, it's much more organic
yeah.
than anything remote. So
And often, in large companies, it might be the only time that you really socially connect with other large parts of the business that you never see. Like, I definitely found that at Simply Health, you know, like walking through the office, you'd see like the finance team, you'd see the tech team, you see all of these teams, which, you know, some of them I worked closely with, but others like I didn't. And it was really nice to be able to kind of like stand there and have a little chat and see them all, you know. What was I going to say? I think I'm interested to know what type of work you think then best happens at home, because you just touched upon it, right?
Yeah. So it's the kind of day when like I just had to do something really complicated and a piece of analysis that actually took me about 2 days of like combing through lots of different inputs and working out how like 15 different markets do something and then coming up with a recommendation when there are like, I don't know, hundreds of dimensions of difference between them. That is the kind of thing that I cannot do in the office. I cannot do interrupted. I like fully need to focus and get in the zone.
Yeah.
And like that's work that I would never do in the office.
Mm.
Other work I wouldn't do in the office is like staff sensitive work. So
Yeah. Yeah.
restructuring, anything like that, you cannot pull up your PowerPoint in the open plan. So
Yeah.
I would never do that in the office. Like that's not fine. And you know, part of that is part of my job, and that's just confidential, and that would be stupid to do in the office. And then I think, go on.
I was going to say, do you have enough flexibility in your work setup right now that you can actually plan your days around like, oh, I need to do that day, and that's pretty sensitive, so I'll stay at home?
So I only like I have it's just me and one other person who I absolutely adore, and we go in every Wednesday because we want to hang out. But other than that, we don't go into the office unless like someone is coming in from overseas or like there's a reason that we need to be in or you know leaving drinks, whatever. Um, but I do plan the rest of my week around those blocks of deep work. I really hate the concept of deep work. It basically just means concentrating. So um, I don't. I haven't read the book about it. I don't know if I'd recommend the book, but
I I would.
of course you have. You're such a nerd. But it's the work that you just genuinely need to do uninterrupted because you're on such a like complex thought train. The other thing that I probably like a load of my calls are international. So I don't need to be in the my worst day in the office is when I have a bunch of Zoom calls like globally that I'm just like I could just be sat at home and then I could have my own snacks.
Yeah. And sometimes the office, you know, one thing I'm finding, so I probably don't have enough foresight into my schedule where I could be like, oh, that needs to be done that day. So that's definitely an at home day. Sometimes I do, but definitely not all the time. Um, but like what I've really noticed about we have a co-working space, and I do think a real consideration for the employer is our co-working space is getting incredibly distracting, like to the point where I definitely cannot do anything that requires a lot of deep work in the office. And I think there is a bit of a like responsibility on the employer, if they're going to ask people to come in for specific reasons, to not only like be there for those reasons and like for them to be justifiable, but also to make sure that that environment like is a place where you could have a meeting, a private meeting room, and discuss a restructuring, like is actually a working environment where you can do the things that you've asked them to come in for.
Yeah.
And I think that in co-working spaces you see a lot like quite weirdly sensitive like company strategy meetings like happening on a large table in a kitchen, and I'm like, that is like nuts. And I really wouldn't enjoy that, because I wouldn't feel comfortable to like, you know, necessarily share like everything that I was thinking. So I think there's an interesting employer responsibility of like, you really have to think about the environment you're creating and what you want and expect of your team, because if they're constantly distracted by a really noisy environment, you may not get your like deep work outputs at the rate that you expect.
Can I just share one of my anecdotes? So this was, if anyone is listening in the team, you'll know exactly who I'm talking about. this hilarious woman who used to manage a team that I was in. And at the time, I thought it was really strange. And like, as I've got older and more experienced, I'm like, she's a freaking genius. It was just pre-pandemic. She used to come to the office, not with noise cancelling headphones, but like ear defenders, like the kind of things that you like builders wear. She just didn't want any sound. It's like, she was just like, I need silence.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I love that vibe. Yeah, like it's definitely as our office has got busier, I have like started to notice that there are types of work and it's not just me, it's like that the whole team cannot do in person. So then we have to think probably a bit more carefully about our actual office setup maybe. But yeah, it's interesting. What other listener questions do we have, if any, on this?
So we have this is a really interesting question. Flexible working is obviously good for parents. Does that mean the same rules have to apply for everyone? Isn't that the fairest thing?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Like,
Um,
I do think you can't easily justify one rule for some and another rule for others, especially not when it's about your life choices and your setup. Um, what I think we've kind of covered before is like, I do think there are individual cases where you can be like, I need you to come into the office to do XYZ. But I think it would be really hard at a company level to say parents can have 3 days at home, but non-parents can't.
yeah, super interesting. And as a non-parent, I'm grateful to all of the parents who have paved the way for all of us. Thank
Agreed.
you. Thank you for your work on this. We appreciate you.
Yeah, and I think it is one really big positive of the pandemic is that it has changed massively the corporate world's attitudes towards flexible working, and I think that is really a really really positive thing, and I don't think it will bounce back to where it was before, and I think that's a good thing overall. But yeah, you can't have one rule for some and you can't, well, or I guess you can, right? But I just think it's very very hard to manage that level of complexity, and why would you? It doesn't seem very just.
Yeah, although like I agree with absolutely everything you've said. I'm just thinking of an example of like if I see a parent leaving the office at like 3:34, I'm like, good on ya, doing the pickup. But if I see a non-parent leaving, I'm like, where are you going? there's still 2 more hours of the workday, which is
Yeah.
obviously a prejudice that I hold on to. In my and maybe like this is a thing that we'll look back on, and when Gen Z's become our boss, they'll be like, yeah, you guys were crazy. But I can't. I find it a bit difficult to soften that position when like you see people like arriving really late or leaving really early, and they're not like, it doesn't feel like there's a legitimate excuse. Again, maybe this goes back to trust and
Yeah, I was going to say, literally the same thing you said to me earlier, to like reflect back at you, which is like, what if that person was your top performer?
yeah,
You'd probably just think, yeah, they've got a doctor's appointment. They're probably just going to that. You'd assume that there's like a legitimate reason. Whereas if it's somewhere where you haven't had the output that you're looking for like 3 weeks, you might not.
yeah.
Or that's how it would be for me as well. Um, I think one thing that's interesting though with like parents that I think can be really hard to talk about as a manager is when flexibility goes like very far, and for example there are like babies in meetings, like kids on the phone, like, and it starts to feel that there is like regularly childcare going on in working hours without agreement that that's
Mm,
okay. And I think that that's, in all honesty, something to be like nipped in the bud quite fast, because the longer you leave it, the harder that conversation gets. And
mm.
I think that there are absolutely legitimate days where that happens, like
Yeah,
emergency
like
days.
the kid has vomited at nursery and you have to go and pick it up,
Of course.
whatever. Yeah,
But I have definitely heard, and not experienced anywhere I work, but like I have heard of places where that's like a 1 day a week. There's, Billy in the background kind of thing. And I think what's difficult about that is Billy may be an angel child and really good, but I think it is hard if you're the other person on the end of the phone when you like know there's a child in the room and you know that you may not have the full attention and the like active listening of the person you are speaking to. It can just be subconsciously distracting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the solution to this is like better and more affordable childcare, but
A
unfortunately, that's
hundred
not in our control.
exactly,
No.
100% that is the solution. And that is a real like, let's hope the whatever the new government is takes that problem seriously, because it's an absolute joke in this country, the childcare system. But like, but I do think that that is something that has to be managed or just talked about. Like, do you need core hours? Do we
Yeah.
need to agree a different setup? um
I would find it very difficult to believe that you could routinely look after a child and do a full day of work at the same time. Just because,
yes.
like, it's hard enough to concentrate on your own at home working. Like, if you
Yeah.
add a whole person to be responsible for as well, that's sometimes my cat vomits in a meeting, and I'm like, oh God, I'm so sorry. Um,
Yeah, and I mean, I work in the most like female friendly, progressive environment, right? And babies are there, not in this way, not in an unwanted way, but like there are meetings where there are babies because we're a women's health company and people have kids, but it is like it's not the norm, right?
yeah,
It's like the odd and an informal meeting. It's like an end of week catch up, a like team, reflect meeting. It's not something where people have to use their real kind of brain power. Um, or on this very few occasions where it has been that, there's obviously like an apology and an acknowledgement of it, which isn't needed because, like, from my perspective, I'm okay. But I do think a new person coming in, for example, could find that really difficult to like get
mm,
used to. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm very proud of like how flexible the place I work is at the moment. I think it's absolutely amazing, and I've learned a lot about how flexible environments can be. But also, yeah, I just think you have to be careful with, yeah, the extent of flexibility that you do give parents. Um, because it is that trust thing. I think again, it's like you trust that if they're doing what they say, as well as you giving, your flexibility to them.
yeah. And that was it for the list of questions. Is there anything else on hybrid working for you?
No. How would we sum up this episode?
We love hybrid working. And specifically, we love high performers in hybrid working, but perhaps we are less convinced about mid to low performers in a hybrid environment, and
Yeah.
that perhaps we would be less lenient on those. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I might say, you know, if earn your trust and maybe consider earning trust in person. Talk to your manager if you do need core hours or an adjustment. So there is going to be flexibility, like set those boundaries quite clearly. If you are in a period where you're not performing as well, potentially expect that some of that flexibility might be slightly reined in as a bit of a natural response to, like, I'm not sure what's going on, I haven't seen them in a while. Maybe there is a bit of like just a natural kind of rein back on the flexibility in those scenarios. And yeah, you have the right, I think, to ask or to check if you're being asked to come into the office, is everyone going to be there? Are we doing this in person? And you can expect, I think, as an employee to have a good working environment for the type of work that you are being asked to do. Um,
Yours was more constructive than mine. Well done. The only thing I
Thanks.
will say is just like a final vote for working from home. Like the highlight, the highlight for me of working from home is that you can put your laundry on during the workday, and that means you don't
Yes.
get locked in to your flat on a Saturday doing your laundry. That I'd say is probably the major routine perk that I experience and I'm delighted about. But I just want to give that a bit of airtime too, because it all felt a bit serious and
Yeah, great. I would say the main perk from going in is that you often get some sort of free food from your office establishment. So
oh, it's true. There's a man who walks around our office at 4 o'clock. I don't know if he does it every day, but he does it every Wednesday with biscuits. And I call him Biscuit Mark, and I absolutely love him. And it really makes my day. So
exactly,
good
who doesn't want
diversity of
to?
snacks.
Yeah. Right. Well, it was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for listening, everyone. It's been a joy. We will be coming to you next episode with our final episode of the first season of the Career Coven. So thank you for listening. Please give us lots of stars, share with your pals, and enjoy whatever you're doing this weekend.